Think about it. A Roman legion sets out at dawn. There are tens of thousands of soldiers, each one carrying armor, a helmet, a shield, a spear, and a sword. All of them need 3 meals a day. Tens of thousands of loaves of bread, tons of grain, hundreds of animals. Feed for the horses, wheels for the war chariots, stones for roads, bridges and fortresses. How do you think this machine was running? The moment the emperor simply said march, an invisible hand behind the scenes sprang into action. Tax collectors, revenue officers, merchants, bankers, wealthy dynasties. Rome's glory was, in reality, a giant flow of cash, and every victory carried with it the potential for new debt. The economic heart of Rome was in the Senate, but the blood that kept that heart beating came from ordinary people's pockets. Farmers paid tax in grain. At ports, on roads, at city gates, taxes were collected from merchants. Every new war meant taxes climbed a little higher. Being a Roman citizen was a great honor, but at the same time a heavy burden. A part of whatever you earned inevitably went to the state. As wars dragged on, fields were left empty. Young men conscripted into the army left their land behind. When they returned, they found themselves landless, drowning in debt. On paper, the one in debt might have been the state, but in reality, that debt was being quietly written onto the shoulders of the people. So how did Rome manage to survive for so long? Because war was not just an expense, it also meant loot. From newly conquered lands, gold and silver, slaves, grain and herds of animals, all flowed into Rome. At the beginning, the rule was simple. Declare a war, win it, and pay off your debts with the spoils. A legion's payroll was covered by loot, and the Senate would say, "See, the system works." But this model had a hidden condition. You always had to go further. Bigger armies, more distant lands, more expensive campaigns. After a while, the spoils were no longer enough to cover all those costs. When the state could no longer manage on its own, private capital stepped in. In Rome, there were groups called publicans. Compared to today, they were a hybrid of contractors, tax farmers, and bankers. The state made deals with them like this. You will collect the taxes of this region. You will pay me this fixed amount. The rest is yours. And in the field, the publicani were doing things like raiding fields, crushing small farmers, slapping interest onto late payments. And in a short time, they became the economic masters of a region. The state thought it had secured its cash flow, but now the people were not only indebted to the state, they also owed money to these wealthy families. As Rome kept winning wars, the power of these families grew. So much so that even Senate decisions began to be made in the shadow of money. For an emperor, the most dangerous thing was not the enemy army. It was his own army. Because when wages were not paid, the first rebellion did not break out at the frontier. It erupted inside the legion's tent. That's why emperors had to think of the army's pay before anything else. When a new emperor took the throne, he was expected to give the soldiers a large bonus, what they called a donativum. And most of the time that meant the treasury was emptied from day one. So where did this money come from? Taxes were raised a little more. Wealthy citizens were forced to make donations. And the silver content of the coins being minted was reduced further. In other words, money was being watered down from the inside. The emperor's portrait stayed the same, but just like the empire itself, the inner value of the money was slowly wearing away. In Rome, controlling the mint was as strategic as capturing a fortress. Because whoever's money is being minted, the real power belongs to them. Emperors clashed with their rivals not only on battlefields, but also on the face of the currency. Some new emperors, to display their power, would have their own portrait stamped, issue coins with higher face values, pay the soldiers with freshly minted money. In the short term, this looked like a solution. In the long term, it was opening the door to inflation. People going to the market noticed this. Last year, I could buy a sack of grain with 1 denarius. Now it's not even enough for half. When confidence is shaken, money is no longer just metal. It turns into an empty contract. As Rome grew on the map, its budget grew, and so did its risks. Garrisons were set up in distant provinces. Fortresses were built along the borders. Roads, bridges, aqueducts were constructed. All of this depended on a single thing: regular tax revenues, and the ability to roll over the debt. Every new province was at first a major expense, and only later a potential source of income. But things did not always go according to plan. When rebellions broke out, the legions had to mobilize again. Expenses rose, spoils shrank, and the pressure of debt grew. At some point, the system began to creak under its own weight. And finally, history's famous question appeared: how much longer can this empire really endure? Rome did not collapse in a single night. For years, money was watered down, taxes were increased, the gap between rich and poor widened, people lost their faith in the justice of the state and in its money. When the barbarians finally came to the gates, the problem was not just the enemy outside. Rome was already exhausted from within. Unable to find new sources of revenue for the army's pay, the emperor began giving land to the soldiers instead. To escape taxes, people fled from cities to the countryside. Local powers that were nominally tied to the center became increasingly independent. On the map, it was still a huge empire, but economically, it had long been hollowed out. The sword was still shining, but the hand that held it was crushed under the weight of debt. Now let's pause and think. Today, states are also feeding massive armies, undertaking massive projects, keeping a massive bureaucracy running. And what do they use for all of this? Taxes, borrowing, money printing, interest policies. In Rome, there were mints. Today we have central banks. In Rome, wealthy families lent money to the state. Today, that role is played by banks, funds, and markets. Anyone who wants to hold on to power first tries to control the flow of money. And every system at some point faces the same test. How big can the debt grow? How much burden can the people carry? How much can money be watered down? If we lend an ear to Rome, it whispers to us. If you want to understand the true power of an empire, don't look at the battlefield. Look at the accounting records. The story of Rome's empire of debt is not just a tale left behind in the past. The money you use today, the taxes you pay, the economic news you watch. Any one of these could be lines in a new Roman story. So don't watch this episode just as history. Ask yourself, how much debt can the system I live in really carry? What does the money I trust actually rest on? Because the greatest lesson of history is this: before the sword falls, the money has already sounded the alarm. Save this video, and one day when you read a piece of news, remember Rome's whisper. And if you want to see more of these stories, subscribe to the channel. Let's keep looking together at the face of history that is written with money.